Today, we'll talk about the most legendary philosopher who, to this day, no one has managed to outshine, and whose antics have become the stuff of legends. As you've probably guessed, we're talking about Diogenes. This wandering Greek philosopher lived in a barrel or a large clay jar, relieved himself right on the streets of Athens, and despised social norms. He chose the life of a beggar and spent his days literally insulting people to make them think about philosophy, or just for the fun of it. He also considered Plato a windbag, thought rich people were fools, and even openly disrespected Alexander the Great himself. In short, there's a lot to learn from him. How to philosophically rebel against society, why dogs are wiser than humans, and why we should be more tolerant of irritating debaters. To start, I'd like to mention the book The Outrageous Life and Ideas of Diogenes of Sinope, published by Oxford University. It's a wonderful work for those who want to dive deeper into Diogenes' philosophy. Now, let's immerse ourselves in the mind of this greatest critic and see what he can teach us. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard reflected on the concept of the night of infinite resignation, an extremely complex and controversial idea. Kierkegaard meant a person who renounces their earthly desires and aspirations. Such a night might love someone with all their heart, but also accept that they may never be together. They embrace this fact and can transform earthly desires into something abstract, infinite, and eternal. But Diogenes perhaps went even further. He scornfully rejected all earthly comforts, mocking the petty desires of his fellow citizens. He deliberately chose a life of extreme poverty, despite having administrative skills that could have easily secured him a job if he had wanted one. However, he considered the accumulation of even a small amount of wealth a sign of foolishness. While Aristotle taught moderation and the pursuit of the golden mean, Diogenes proclaimed complete renunciation. While Epicurus said one should be grateful for food, water, and a roof over their head, Diogenes argued that even these basic things were excessive. He lived in a clay jar and begged for food to survive. His attempts to avoid any comfort sometimes became almost comical. In winter, he would embrace frozen statues, and in summer, he would roll in hot sand under the scorching sun. All his actions rejected the pleasures that those around him enjoyed. At first glance, his philosophy seems absurd. Diogenes didn't suffer for the sake of a future reward. He wasn't like a student staying up all night to pass an exam or a martyr sacrificing their life for faith. Diogenes rejected comfort because he saw no value in it, despised it, and considered it a limitation on freedom. Diogenes and the Cynics who followed his teachings had an unusual worldview. They believed there were three types of beings: animals, humans, and gods. Gods, in their view, were beyond reach, so they could be disregarded. However, animals, according to Diogenes, surpassed humans. Unlike Plato, who saw humans as unique in their reason and imagination, Diogenes focused on how these qualities generate anxiety. He looked at stray dogs and saw that they were perfectly content. If dogs weren't in danger, they were at peace with themselves and the world around them. Dogs didn't worry about world news or whether they'd find love. They were simply satisfied with what they had. Diogenes observed how dogs scavenged a bit of food, curled up, and fell asleep immediately. At least that's how he interpreted it. If you think about it, you can see the seeds of Stoic philosophy in this. Diogenes also believed that the more a person renounces material possessions, the freer they become. He saw ownership as a trap that ties us to a specific place and role. If you have a steady job, you're bound to it. If you have a lot of money, you need to hire guards to protect it. Paradoxically, for Diogenes, the ultimate freedom was the rejection of all possessions. It's truly strange to see poverty perceived as a blessing. Diogenes believed that the more we have, the more we'll want, and the more we want, the less free we are, because our actions will be driven by satisfying those desires. He thought the only way to be truly free was to own nothing and live, as he put it, like a dog, accepting whatever fate and nature bring. Of course, not everyone is ready to go as far as Diogenes. Calling poverty a blessing might seem odd, but there's a lot of wisdom in his message. It's often thought that most suffering comes from a lack of something. but Diogenes argued that suffering stems from the desire for more. In his view, if a person has food, they shouldn't want anything else. Diogenes embodied this worldview in practice, living on the streets without shelter and calling himself the richest person he knew. This might make us reflect, where are our own desires directed, and shouldn't we reconsider our craving for material things in favor of a simpler life? According to Diogenes, this would make us not only wiser, but also freer. But this overlooks perhaps one of the most important aspects of Diogenes' philosophy, his sharp critique of society, which is probably what he's most remembered for today. In philosophy, it's almost a tradition to criticize the society you live in or predict its decline. Socrates believed that many Athenians of his time were full of nonsense and needed philosophical correction. Nietzsche called the dominant Christian moral system of 19th century Europe dangerous and outdated. But perhaps no one was as ruthless a critic of society as Diogenes. Where others saw the great Greek polis as a bulwark against the horrors of the wild world, Diogenes saw a stream of derivative constraints on human freedom. In one famous incident, Diogenes was visited by the legendary conqueror Alexander the Great, who was then only the king of Macedon. Having heard about the philosopher living on the streets and symbolizing rebellion against society, Alexander decided to test his resolve. Seeing Diogenes lying in poverty, he offered to grant any wish. Diogenes replied that he only wanted Alexander to step aside and stop blocking his sunlight. In another story, Diogenes was captured by Alexander's father, Philip of Macedon, and behaved so boldly that Philip was both shocked and impressed. In the end, he released the philosopher as proof of his courage and consistency. For Diogenes, most of the values of ancient Greece were merely collective illusions. He didn't care who was the king of Macedon, the leader of Athens, or even Persia. To him, societal distinctions were meaningless. This makes Diogenes a remarkably modern philosopher. Remember, he was a contemporary of Aristotle, who argued that some people were naturally superior to others, and Plato, who believed some deserved privileged positions in society. Diogenes considered such views absurd. This aligned perfectly with Cynic philosophy, which respected the natural qualities of humanity. Diogenes would likely have said that advantages of one person over another might arise in nature, but these differences have no normative or moral significance. He seemed to take pride in treating everyone with equal respect and equal contempt. We might call him an equal opportunity hater or a curmudgeon, depending on your perspective. This rejection of everything that most of Hellenistic society considered right and proper extended to all aspects of his life. Diogenes lived as a beggar, partly as part of his vow of poverty, but also because begging was considered the lowest rung of Athenian society. In much of ancient Greece, citizens were united by the idea that they all contributed to the common good of the polis. However, beggars were seen as parasites, existing outside this system. They were often beaten, spat on, and ridiculed. Diogenes believed this was his rightful place because anything else would mean participating in a society he found absurd. This lifestyle also allowed him to criticize Greek polis without the slightest hint of hypocrisy. Diogenes deliberately separated himself from the object of his attacks. As we'll see later, he was a living embodiment of his philosophy. He showed how fragile the expectations of Athenian and Corinthian society were by living outside their norms and thriving. Why did Diogenes act this way? Because social status, like money, was a trap that robbed us of freedom. When we accept a certain societal role, we essentially agree to do some things and refrain from others. Diogenes might not have objected to people voluntarily making such choices, but he urged them to realize that it's a choice, not an obligation. As Jean-Paul Sartre later argued, we are condemned to be free, and the fullness of our freedom can be terrifying. So we willingly pretend to be less free than we are, convincing ourselves that we're bound to a specific role in society. Diogenes was an example of someone who refused to play this game. He represented an alternative way of life, both in word and deed. In a sense, today we've adopted many of his critical views. We no longer practice ostracism, slavery, or the relegation of women to second-class citizens, as was the case in Athenian society. Of course, Diogenes would turn his critical gaze on our world, asking, which of our conventions are also arbitrary or irrational? Whether you're an aspiring political radical or simply someone who wants to live in society with eyes wide open, we can all learn a lot from this ancient but bold philosopher. In the modern world, being shameless or crass is considered a rather offensive insult, but Diogenes didn't see it that way. He embraced shamelessness as the only true moral stance. This suggests how morally corrupt and disconnected from all that is right and just a person must be to not even feel shame for their pitiful state. The American philosopher Eve Sedgwick explored the role of shame and how it forces people to control their behavior, even when no one is watching. On the other hand, Gabriel Marcel described shame as a potential mechanism for correction, guiding us toward a more ethical life. Diogenes' philosophy on this matter deserves attention for its radical stance. He simply had no sense of shame. Sources report numerous shameless acts. He openly engaged in indecent behavior in public, defecated on the street, insulted passers-by, and shouted obscenities at the rich and wise. Once he masturbated in public, and on another occasion he said, "If only I could rub my stomach and make hunger go away." When he heard Plato's definition of a human as a featherless biped, he showed up at the academy with a plucked chicken and loudly declared, "Here, Plato, look, this is a human." He seemed entirely unaffected by the societal pressure that typically restrains others. His lack of shame also allowed him to endure extreme poverty. He felt no embarrassment for his filth or rudeness, and could calmly sit in the Athenian sun, reeking terribly and enjoying the effect he had on those around him. This was another example of mimicking animal behavior. Dogs don't feel shame when they relieve themselves on the street, so why should we? Other philosophical schools might argue that humans are smarter than animals and have created rational systems to make life easier and more orderly. But, as we've already said, Diogenes saw all these systems as restrictions on freedom and machines for generating shame. So he did whatever he wanted and told all the great philosophers to go to hell. However, this doesn't mean Diogenes lacked principles. His principles aligned with his rejection of societal shame. His ethical system boiled down to living like an animal, being maximally sincere and honest, and rejecting anything that limited his freedom or that of others. Shame, in his view, distanced people from these goals. It might be tempting to portray Diogenes' philosophy as almost sociopathic, but that would be a caricature. The Cynics didn't value violence or freedom of choice as universal rights. For Diogenes, shame seemed to do the opposite. He saw it as a force that pressured people into making decisions, judging others without good reason, and attacking their neighbors to divert the all-seeing eye of shame from their own flaws. These criticisms should be taken seriously, even if we're not ready to go as far as Diogenes. Shame has caused tremendous harm to the human psyche across generations. It has forced us to suppress our deepest feelings, discriminate based on arbitrary traits, and uphold cruel moral systems that mutilated people. The absence of shame helps cultivate a valuable but hard-to-achieve quality: authenticity. This is honesty with oneself and others about one's beliefs and desires. Many of us have aspects of our personality that we value but hesitate to show others. We may fear displaying vulnerability to friends or admitting to a partner something that deeply hurt us. Shame about such things intensifies feelings of isolation, creating the impression that no one truly knows us, and if they did, they'd hate us. Shedding this shame can open up a world of new possibilities. You might reflect on what you'd do if you felt no shame. But according to Diogenes, you'll never know what you truly want until you rid yourself of shame. After all, Shame is the strict overseer that controls not only your actions, but also your thoughts and desires. But we're not done with Diogenes yet. Let's turn to his overall approach and consider what he can tell us about different ways of philosophizing and finding balance. There's a popular saying, everyone's a critic. Diogenes fully embodied this principle. We know very little about his positive philosophy, though he undoubtedly had one. Diogenes Laertius, a different Diogenes, not the dog, reports, citing Sotion, that Diogenes of Sinope, the dog, wrote 21 works, including 14 dialogues and 7 tragedies. None of these works have survived. Diogenes wrote a book called The Republic, where he outlined his vision of an ideal society. However, much of his ideas were aimed at criticizing what Athenians considered the proper structure of the state. He argued that nearly all sexual taboos could be abolished provided there was mutual consent. He also proposed abandoning many important rituals of ancient Greek culture. Unlike most philosophers of his time, Diogenes was utterly uninterested in questions about gods. He considered religious institutions an obstacle to human freedom and suggested getting rid of them. From the surviving fragments of his work and aphorisms, it's clear that he was more likely to offer sharp criticism than positive advice. We're left with the image of a man standing on the sidelines of society, hurling accusations from his ceramic jar. It's easy to see Diogenes as a pitiful figure whose philosophy was merely a reaction to dominant views. But even if that's true, his sharp and oppositional instinct isn't necessarily bad. In fact, we could sometimes use a bit of that criticism ourselves. Diogenes' Cynic philosophy helps combat 3 common cognitive biases. The first is confirmation bias, our tendency to seek information that confirms our existing beliefs rather than accepting data that contradicts them. The second is de-individuation, the phenomenon where we lose personal responsibility when others share our views or when we're in a crowd. The third is the repetition effect, believing information is true and authentic simply because it's been repeated many times, not because there's evidence of its truth. These biases form a kind of stone wall that hinders the development of our thinking, both individually and collectively. If you think about the people you know, how many of them have views that almost perfectly align with the beliefs of those they spend the most time with? Or consider how much of the internet has split into isolated echo chambers, where the group's dominant views are rarely questioned. And here comes Diogenes, a sharp and sometimes caustic critic who almost instinctively takes the opposite stance to the majority opinion. His role is to shake up a group of people who feel too comfortable within their own beliefs. Plato once called Diogenes a mad Socrates. He meant it as an insult, but I think it's a rather accurate description. While Socrates was a master of polite and civilized dialogue, Diogenes, with his witty taunts and sharp tongue, simply couldn't be ignored. He was a thorn in the side of traditional thinking, the supreme devil's advocate, and an irritant to anyone who just wanted to have a quiet chat with friends. This role is, in some ways, incredibly valuable. Without such bold and unpleasant countercultural thinkers, we risk falling into autopilot, losing the ability to step outside our own perspective and see the world anew. We might become like the image of Hegel described by Kierkegaard, people who repeat the same doctrine without understanding why they believe it or what its consequences are. It's no surprise that many people hurled insults at Diogenes. It's said he often had visible bruises from the blows of those he criticized. He had so many enemies that he began wearing their names around his neck. This isn't surprising. It's far more comfortable to sit idly and reinforce your beliefs than to endure mockery and attacks from detractors. It's worth noting that respect for Diogenes only emerged many years after his death, when people no longer risked encountering him in person. Of course, a society full of such contentious critics would be a disaster. There would be no cohesion, no unity, only endless distrust. But a few such figures here and there could be beneficial. So, when someone like Diogenes appears in your life, it's worth remembering that we might gain something from it. Yes, they may be rude, unpleasant, and off-putting, but in some ways we're better off with them than without. That is, provided we can see the value in Diogenes' approach. However, there is one trait that continues to inspire respect for this ancient cynic even centuries later, and that is a view of philosophy that could benefit us all if we practiced and preached it. Diogenes despised Plato. Plato could sharply criticize the governments of city-states while associating with the dictator of Syracuse. Diogenes described him as all talk and no action, and considered him a false heir to Socrates' more grounded approach. No accusation of hypocrisy could be leveled at Diogenes himself. He preached that material possessions should be devalued and lived on the street with only a staff and a cloak on his shoulders. He made no distinction between the high-ranking and the poor, treating everyone the same, even if it put him in great danger. He believed that people had much to learn from dogs and thus imitated their behavior. Diogenes was a living embodiment of his philosophy, and this in part earned him the reluctant respect of some Athenians. Legend has it that when a cruel young man smashed the barrel in which Diogenes lived, the city voted to provide him with a new one. Diogenes would find much to criticize in many of us. Most of us have stated principles that are supposed to guide our lives. But do we truly live according to these principles?